any movie that makes a killing at the box office is destined to get a sequel, that is, with a very few exceptions, and of course you'd expect classic characters from the original to return for the sequel, right? Well, for whatever the reason, these 10 iconic movie characters were all unexpectedly subbed out for sequels and replaced in extremely peculiar fashion. So let's take a look at them. As I'm Jules, this is Whatculture.com, and these are 10 iconic movie characters weirdly replaced in movie sequels. Number 10. Marion Ravenwood, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. Now, Raiders of the Lost Ark is a practically perfect movie from its writing to its direction and casting. As impossible as it is to imagine anyone but Harrison Ford playing Indiana Jones, it's equally tough to picture anybody other than Karen Allen in the role of Indy's spunky love interest Marion Ravenwood. Their dynamic in Raiders was absolutely dynamite, and so there was little doubt among fans that Marion would be returning for the inevitable sequel. And indeed, director Steven Spielberg originally intended to bring her back for Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, with a plot set to focus around her archaeologist father Abner, who was briefly mentioned in Raiders. Yet it was ultimately decided between Spielberg and George Lucas that it would be more fun for Indy to have a different female companion in each movie, mirroring the James Bond franchise's revolving door policy to 007's love interests. Temple of Doom was written as a prequel set a year prior to Raiders in order to avoid having to use Nazis as villains again, while also ensuring it wouldn't make any logical sense for the estranged Marion to appear. But even so, many were taken aback when Marion's replacement turned out to be Willie Scott, an almost polar opposite character in terms of appearance and personality. With her platinum blonde feathered do, penchant for fancy clothes, distaste for dirt and generally shrill demeanor, she couldn't have been much more different than Marion, which was absolutely the point. But it was still incredibly jarring for fans though. Marion was so beloved by comparison, and the idea of shuffling her out for a character near universally regarded as inferior seemed totally unnecessary, as did the film's general placement as a prequel. But at least Marion did return for a small role in the fourth film, Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, which arguably has to be the best bit about that film. Great. Number 9. Tom Hagen, The Godfather Part 3. Tom Hagen, played by Robert Duvall, appeared in the first two Godfather movies as a pseudo-lawyer for the Corleone crime family, typically serving as a voice of reason during fraught situations. His cunning allowed the Corleones to survive some pretty close calls, and if a smart, cool-headed individual was ever needed to help resolve a situation, there was nobody better suited in the family's employ. Tom Hagen is one of the series' most iconic characters, in large part thanks to Robert Duvall's terrific performance, which in the original film netted him a Best Supporting Actor Oscar nomination. Sadly, when Francis Ford Coppola was prepping the belated sequel The Godfather Part 3, Duvall had a salary dispute with the producers and opted not to return, causing a planned narrative centered around Tom feuding with Michael Corleone to be scrapped. Instead, Coppola had Hagen die off-screen and effectively replaced him with a new lawyer character, B.J. Harrison. In addition to Part 3's many other problems, most fans felt that the threequel desperately wanted for Hagen's presence, and the rather charisma-devoid Harrison was unfortunately just a transparent, unremarkable substitute. Number 8. Michaela Baines, Transformers: Dark of the Moon. As much as you might want to deny it, the visual of Sam's love interest, Michaela Baines, lithely leaning underneath the hood of Bumblebee is probably the single most iconic image in Michael Bay's entire Transformers franchise, which really says a lot. Michaela returned for the first sequel, Revenge of the Fallen, though was unceremoniously kicked to the curb for the threequel, Dark of the Moon, after she compared Bay to Adolf Hitler in interviews. For anyone not following the controversy though, Michaela's sudden absence in Dark of the Moon sure was pretty strange. It's casually mentioned in a quick throwaway dialogue exchange that Michaela ended up dumping Sam, all while a new love interest, Carly, is speedily transitioned in. Now, fan response to Carly was wildly mixed, many feeling that the more tomboy-ish Michaela was a better fit for a franchise centered around cars, while the more stereotypically air quotes girly Carly, who spends most of the film helplessly caught in the middle of the action, was a poor substitute. All in all, it's hilariously obvious that the role of Carly was originally written for Michaela and simply rejigged to fit a new character, and Carly's chemistry with Sam doesn't quite measure up to that of his more fiery dynamic with Michaela. It didn't really matter though, as Sam himself was jettisoned from the franchise in the next sequel, Age of Extinction, where he was replaced with older lead Cade Brill. Number 7. Skynet, Terminator: Dark Fate. While fans were understandably upset that franchise protagonist John Connor was suddenly killed off at the start of Terminator: Dark Fate in order to pave a new way for a new Resistance leader, at least it's easy enough to trace the cold, cynical logic of a studio wanting to soft reboot their franchise. But what made a lot less sense was the head-scratching decision to take the series' overpowering AI antagonist Skynet, which was quite literally embodied as a character by Matt Smith in Terminator: Giant Ice, and give it a lousy, pointless reboot. In Dark Fate, Skynet is declared her defeated due to the efforts of Sarah Connor and company at the end of Terminator 2, only for a functionally identical AI villain known as Legion to take its place and assume the exact same humanity-threatening role. Given that Legion is an infinitely more generic and uninteresting name than Skynet, and the machines it produced looked incredibly similar to Skynet Terminators, this felt like a totally pointless change intended only to create a defined gap between the Terminator era of old and new. For a film that wanted to be a direct sequel to T2 while disregarding all of the other sequels, replacing Skynet with Legion ironically only underlined how aggressively this air quotes legacy sequel was a glorified soft reboot. Number 6. Elizabeth Swan, Pirates of the Caribbean on Stranger Tides and Dead Men Tell No Tales. Despite the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise basically being the Jack Sparrow show, Elizabeth Swan is nevertheless one of blockbuster cinema's most prominent and memorable female leads, largely due to Knightley's amusing straight guy performance. Swan was an outright protagonist of the first 3 films, though ended up sitting out number 4 on Stranger Tides due to a desire to work on other projects. While Blackbeard's daughter Angelica initially seemed like a fitting replacement, the film went further and literally introduced ridiculously obvious younger substitutes for not just Elizabeth, but also her love interest Will as well. On Stranger Tides, it gave us mercenary Philip Swift and mermaid Serena, who were clearly fashioned as the new Will and Elizabeth. Reception was wildly mixed, and so neither returned for the 5th and most recent film, Dead Men Tell No Tales. Though Knightley did reprise the role of Elizabeth for a brief cameo she literally filmed in a single day, Elizabeth was again replaced with a younger substitute for the bulk of the movie. This time, new Elizabeth was astronomer Karina, a headstrong young woman who clashes with Jack Sparrow, not unlike a younger Elizabeth herself. The similarities were striking enough that Karina basically felt like a reboot of the Elizabeth character, yet to the film's modest credit, Karina was also the best part of it. Number 5. Stephen Hiller, Independence Day Resurgence. Though Roland Emmerich's iconic alien invasion blockbuster Independence Day is elevated considerably by its brilliant ensemble cast, there's no denying that Marine pilot Stephen Hiller, played by Will Smith, is the absolute star of the show. Smith just drips charisma and likability throughout, and so when the belated sequel finally began to coalesce almost 20 years later, there was a fair expectation that he would be returning. But Smith ultimately opted not to return, either due to a salary dispute or scheduling conflicts, depending on who you believe, and so he was replaced with Hiller's now grown stepson, Dylan. Unsurprisingly, replacing the first film's star attraction with a stepson character who the audience had basically zero emotional attachment to and whose actor patently lacked Smith's overpowering charm was a recipe for disaster. As if this didn't leave a sour enough taste, Emmerich made the drastic decision to have Stephen be killed off screen, closing the door on the character completely rather than keeping the possibility open for Smith's return in future movies. Resurgence was ultimately a major commercial disappointment, and an undeniably big part of the reason for this was the absence of Smith's larger-than-life persona. Number 4. Rose, Star Wars Rise of Skywalker. It's fair to say that Star Wars The Last Jedi was a hugely divisive film with fans, despite scoring largely positive reviews, and one of its most polarizing elements was the introduction of Resistance mechanic Rose. While some felt she brought some welcome diversity to the franchise and served as a cute foil for Finn, others opined that her romance with Finn was rushed and she was ultimately unnecessary in the general scope of the story. Nevertheless, Rose became an iconic and highly recognizable character overnight, such that it seemed inevitable that she would have a large role in the follow-up, The Rise of Skywalker. Bafflingly then, Rose is reduced to basically a cameo role in the film with just a few lines of dialogue, all while numerous new and ultimately quite superfluous characters are introduced, including Resistance fighter Yana. She forges a fast bond with Finn due to their respective pasts as former stormtroopers, and it ultimately feels like she was created as a reaction to the online negativity surrounding Rose to basically act as her replacement. She's certainly not a copy-paste Rose doppelganger, but the dynamic with Finn felt like it was just initially reserved for Rose only to be awkwardly changed during the film's infamously messy production. For his part, Abrams insists that Rose's role was reduced down post-production due to how much of it originally involved Princess Leia, whose own arc had to be rejigged following Carrie Fisher's death. Number 3. Savic, Star Trek VI: The Undiscovered Country. One of the Star Trek movies' most popular supporting characters is Vulcan Starfleet Lieutenant Savic, who was played by Kirstie Alley in The Wrath of Khan and then Robin Curtis in the follow-ups The Search for Spock and The Voyage Home. But Savic was also written into the script for the 6th and final film featuring the original series' main cast, The Undiscovered Country. The script revealed Savic to be a traitor, but after Trek creator Gene Roddenberry objected to a beloved fan favorite character turning heel out of nowhere, it was decided to reimagine the turncoat as a new new character. And so Valeris was born, Spock's Vulcan protege, as played by the great Kim Cattrall. It's hilariously obvious to anyone watching that Valeris is a Savic surrogate, with the original role receiving only the most minor, transparent rewrites to tweak her into somebody air quotes new. Given that Savic remains a hugely popular Trek character to this day though, it was probably a smart decision all things considered, as peculiar as it is that she just, well, disappears after the voyage home. Number 2. Slimer, Ghostbusters Afterlife. Despite Ghostbusters Afterlife being an aggressive exercise in fan service, it was genuinely surprising not to see even a single fleeting glimpse of everyone's favourite gluttonous ghost, Slimer. Slimer is as much an icon of the franchise as any of its human characters, and despite the new film's Somerville, Oklahoma setting, a lot of fans would have loved to have seen the big green guy roaming around. Instead, Slimer was very obviously switched out for Muncher, a Slimer-adjacent ghost distinguished by his blue colouring and admittedly very cool ability to eat metal and then spit it back out in projectile form. Writer-director Jason Reitman has backed up the notion that he swapped out Slimer for new ghosts who would be native to the area, but in a movie that so shamelessly holds every major piece of Ghostbusters iconography as sacrosanct, whether it makes sense or not, this seems like an odd place to draw the line of restraint. And number 1, Lois Lane, Superman 3. Margot Kidder's portrayal of Lois Lane in the first 2 Superman movies is nothing short of iconic, and Kidder's dynamic with Christopher Reeve's Clark Kent/Superman was so perfect that fans were all too happy to see more of it in Superman 3, and so many were dismayed to see Lois get the egregiously short shrift in the 3rd movie, her expectedly upfront role reduced to a several-minute cameo consisting of just 12 lines of dialogue before she heads off to Bermuda on vacation. Kidder insists that she was punished for criticizing the film's producers for how they treated director Richard Donner on Superman 2, a claim they nevertheless deny. All the same, Lois was replaced as the female lead by Clark's new love interest from the comics, Lana Lang. Though Lana was a perfectly respectable new flame for Clark in her own right, fans were generally far more invested in seeing Lois and Clark get back together. Sadly, Superman 3 marked the point at which the Reeve Superman movies began to fall off a cliff, so it wasn't only Lois it did a huge disservice to.